I'd like to bring up Grouse Barnes, an elder from the West Bank First Nation, to do an introduction and welcome.
White please, not clear. Who might wish to you guys want to stand, please? Take your hats off. You want to move your hats? Thank you. Well, them couldn't shouldn't kind of wish. Tali has these boos can a lot is kalaw. Ya stem it's stem. Nikwa kai tum hula. In chakalak tum hula. Cooks woya cooks crab stemaka ul the hast. Ya stem it's cool stem the hast nikwa Piayat prala Chikala Lutzwit Kasanoms Ulnehu Kui Utlutzwit Kasanoms Tali Hastis Buskanala Wikan Yayati he Swinum he Clark Hab he Tiketabil Yayat with Kaltamil Yayat Aha Kulstum Tahast. I want to thank the Creator for allowing me to be here this evening to do a little opening for you and a little prayer. The prayer I said is that we all gathered here this evening, and we all got here safe and sound, and that we go home safe and sound. And this land is my land, and I'm a language teacher of sorts, so you're gonna learn one word. What's this lake famous for? That's how you guys see it. Okay, we're going to say it 3 times, okay? It's hard, so get ready. Nachachaetku. Nachachaetku. Oh, that sounds beautiful. One more. Nachachaetku. I thank you very much. You guys can be seated now. Label him.
Thank you, Grass. Thanks for that wonderful welcome to this beautiful, beautiful territory. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to be asked to MC here tonight. As many of you, I'm sure, we've been following the news. We've been thinking a lot about some of the complicated realities that we live in when it comes to questions of land, questions of where we are, and questions of how we get here. So it's a very tricky space to be in, a very difficult space. And to see all these people out here, and thank you all so much for coming, and hoping we'll see everyone here at the university tomorrow. These are critical times, and I think this is some of the most important work that we can do through connections with each other and by listening and watching some very powerful work over the next 2 days. Today we will have, we'll begin the evening with a keynote by Jeannette Armstrong, who will be speaking on immigration in the Okanagan, a Silicate perspective. And we're going to move from there. We'll have a few questions after that, and then we'll move to a performance entitled Land Moving, which reflects on Aboriginal and newcomer relationships in the 21st century, and that'll be by Peter Moran and Ayumi Goto, and I'll introduce all these speakers in just a moment. We'll also, we were going to have a short presentation by Rishma Johal. Some of you may have seen her production at the Alternator, Polkari, pieces of our shared stories within the fields about migrant workers. But we've had some trouble getting the version transferred over, so we may have to wait. We're still checking to see on that. And then there'll be a photo exhibition curated by Susanna, and she's going to be setting that up. It's called Reflections on Indigenous Displacement Across Borders, and that'll just be in the pit. I think we'll get that up later today. So let me begin then by introducing Jeannette Armstrong. Jeannette is a Canada Research Chair in Okanagan Indigenous Knowledge and Philosophy. She has been, as many of you know, an absolutely instrumental individual in education in this territory for countless numbers of years. She was a founder at the Naukin Center, and she's been at UBC for a number of years. I've had the great pleasure of knowing her for a considerable amount of time and being influenced by her ideas and thoughts, and I'm very grateful for that. Jeannette will be speaking to us for about half an hour today, and she's going to take a few questions on after that, and after that we'll move to the performance. So if I could bring up Jeannette Armstrong.
Good evening. I just wanted to thank Elder Barnes for the beautiful prayer that he gave. And some of it he didn't translate, but translated how beautiful you all are, and that he's really happy to welcome you here tonight, and that we all should be feeling good in our hearts about the things that we're talking about. So I really wanted to acknowledge those words, because that's how I feel, and that's the feeling that I come up here to speak about you with. And I want to also thank the organizers of this symposium on immigration, social justice, and the common good, more particularly that last phrase, the common good, I think is really an important concept. I also wanted to acknowledge our High Lady from the Okanagan Nation Alliance, Pauline Terbasket. Thank you for coming tonight. And I'm nervous. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the idea of social justice and the idea of immigration in the Okanagan from a Seal perspective. So I want to start my thoughts in this keynote to provide something of a view from a Seal perspective. And as a Seal person, I really think it's important to enter into this discussion with some clarity around the topic that I want to talk about. As you know, the Okanagan people have been colonized by this government that's been here for a number of years, been on our territory for a number of years, and maybe the perspective that we have is more like the way that a lot of the immigrants in this country feel as minorities and being minoritized, and as foreigners in our own lands. And I think that aspect of it bears another different discussion that's much more political in terms of how the Okanagan Nation views that in relation to immigration. So I'm not going to talk about that direction. I really want to infuse this conversation, this dialogue, more related to the Seal understanding of social justice, and how that social justice might have been constructed originally prior to occupation of our lands, and prior to massive immigrations onto our lands, in that everyone that has immigrated here are, from our point of view, immigrants. And I think that weighs in some ways on that other discussion, and weighs heavily on us. So I choose not to bring that into the conversation. That's the conversation of my leaders and chiefs and hereditary elders in terms of protection of the land. So I wanted to provide that clarity before I start talking about some of the points, just in case you think that that's not on my mind. It is on my mind, but it's not on the topic tonight. But I'd like to situate a Seal perspective on the subject of the impacts of Canadian policy and how we might see it in relation to the idea of social justice. And of course, I want to provide the disclaimer that I don't speak for the Okanagan Nation, and I never want to be seen in that light, mainly because I want to provide a Syilx perspective, to add a different view, and so there might be a different political view, there might be a different community view from various communities and chiefs and leaders of the Okanagan Nation. And in terms of a formal idea that would be put forward by the Okanagan Nation, of course I don't represent them. That's a political position. So I just want to clarify that and provide that disclaimer. And also I wanted to, in terms of looking at alternative perspectives and some of the aspects being raised in this discussion and tomorrow and the rest of the symposium's discussion, I want to make clear that what I'm trying to look at is some of the philosophical ideas behind social justice from an Indigenous view. That's principally the role that I have at UBC Okanagan as the program coordinator for Indigenous Studies and one of the instructors in that program and one of the developers of that program, along with Pauline and other scholars that worked on getting that academy, which is very, very tough to break the walls down and get into, to have an Indigenous Studies program and to have it as a degree program is the area that I'm most familiar with. In my area of research, and I want to make clear that the area of research that I'm involved in doesn't involve Canadian policy on immigration. So I'm not trying to be an expert in that area. I'm sure there's many others who are experts and researchers in that area. So I want to make that clear as well, that my area of research is centered on the Syilx philosophy and the practices that are part of that philosophy, and also the customs by which those practices are guided by our ceremonies and our traditions and the work of our elders who continuously guide us in the right frame of mind toward our people that are now our relations on this land, and toward our own people that sometimes need to have that guidance. And I wanted to also really acknowledge you for providing that word of clarity about Nakaka'itko. That word for us is an important word, and it should be known and understood by everybody. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's part of our thoughts about social justice. And Nakaka'itko is the sacred life force of that lake. And how you choose to manifest it in terms of a physical form, I guess, is up to you. But for us, the sacred life force of that lake, the sacred spirit of that lake is being violated. And we need to all think about that. And so bringing that word into the common good and the lexicon of everyone here, I think, is just as important as understanding the word Syilx or Syilxin or Okanagan or Kelowna or Penticton or Caramus or Smilkmead, which are all Okanagan words that describe this place that we are all a part of now. So I wanted to explain that that's where my area of research is, but I also wanted to mention too that and provide acknowledgement that much of the information in this talk is evidenced in the research that I have done from previous scholars, ethnological researchers and scholars of the Syilx Okanagan. However, a lot of that research has been to verify some of the things that are already known by myself and other people who are narrative oral historians of our culture. And that's probably the easiest way to describe myself as an oral narrative historian of my people, and I've been trained since I was very young to accompany the elders to learn all of the oral history. And so that, I think, provides some context in terms of the framework that I offer my thoughts on immigration, immigrants, refugees, and temporary foreign workers. And I want to frame those three ideas before I move to the talk on the part of the talk at the end on social justice from the SEAL perspective, and some of the principles that we might need to think about and talk about and open up in the dialogue. So I wanted to unpack that concept, some of those three concepts from a SEAL perspective by asking a simple question. Are those words in the SEAL language? Is there a word for immigrant, or an equivalent word or concept or construct? Is there a word for refugee? And also one of the most difficult concepts to wrap my mind around, temporary foreign workers. So one of the reasons that I ask that question is because that is a fundamental way to begin that dialogue, to ask that question, why the word immigrant is there, and why there are groups of people in the country that are classified as immigrants, and why that process of maintaining that status within Canada seems to be part of the policy, and how immigrants are allowed in through the cracks in the wall are really an important part of this discussion. And that idea of refugee, that construct and the meaning of that, the wider meaning of that in terms of refugee status and policy, right? But really foundationally and fundamentally, that idea of being a refugee and that idea of what lies behind that and the questioning of our own humanitarian and social justice policies around that, I think is really an important place to start with in terms of how would I place it as SEAL. So if we were to move back a few hundred years, and it's only been a few hundred years, actually, 200 to be exact, and 3 years. So it hasn't been a long time that we have experienced immigration in terms of the movement across Canada to colonize this country. But I want to talk a little bit about how from the traditional Okanagan points of view, that immigration and that idea might have been constructed and occurred from everything that I've studied and read. So let's look at the word immigrant first of all. I want to look at that from the SEAL perspective and ask, is there a word similar to that, or is there a word that might mean someone who's relocated permanently from their nation of origin to another nation? The SEAL word that I can come closest to isn't a word that labels anyone. It's a word that describes that movement. Sakalhula is meaning, and I want to talk a little bit about that word and what it means and how to break it down in terms of what it implies. It means that a person has changed places on the land. So in all of our stories and on all of our historical narratives, we could find that word and understand exactly what it means, that a person, Sakalhula, from Spokane or from the Wenatchee or from any of the Salish groups, and decided to move here among us as Okanagans, and they would have a different language, they would have different customs, they would have different culture, and so on. And so rather than, and I just want to talk a little bit more about the word, rather than a label, it is an action word, or an action, closer to an action phrase, because our words are more like phrases. They're not like single words. They're like a whole bunch of images put together, and then that becomes described as a word, but it's really more like a phrase. And that phrase describes that a person has decided to shift or change or switch lands. So much like shifting places at a table, it's that kind of shifting, right? I decide to move across the table or at the head of the table or beside my auntie or something like that. So it's that idea. And for all of the same reasons, maybe you do want to sit by your auntie, or maybe you do want to sit across the table because there's someone more lovely over there. And so that word does one thing. It makes the assumption that a person decides to make the change, decides to change place. And it seems to be similar to immigrate or immigration until you ask what place names means. What does place mean? If they decide to shift place or shift land, then you have to ask in the Syilx language, what does place mean? Then you're given the understanding that place and land have completely different meaning for us as Syilx people than is apparent of meaning in English. Just like that word for the sacred life force of the lake, the sacred spirit of the lake. It's not some beast roaming around waiting to be captured on some camera, right? The word Tamhula, place, right, land in English, doesn't actually mean that. The idea of Tamhula can be more closely related to the words describing community or place of relations, in that it is the place of many life forms that are related to each other, who are the Tamih. So you hear that word Tamhula, that's Tamihula, right? Means it's their land, the place of living relations, that it's their land. So in that it is the place of many life forms, and being their place, we as human occupants are just one of the Tamih who are related to all the other Tamih that are there. So when a person decides to shift from one such place to another place like that, it is assumed that they have the fundamental right to make their own life and their family lives better. That's an assumption in that word Sakhalhula. It assumes that it absolutely assumes that they have that fundamental right to make their lives better by moving to another land that allows that. There's no way in that Sakhalhula word that there's an exclusionary term or a restrictive term or idea. So when a person decides to shift from one place to another, it is assumed that that right for relocation from one's place of origin does imply that there's an existing hardship in their place of origin and is the reason that they move. So that word does imply that. The reason that you move, the reason that you sechel is because there's something that's moving you, they're making you move, making you shift. So it does imply that in the wording or in the meaning of it. And since relocation from one's place of origin implies in that sense existing hardships and the basic reason why you want to move, it means that one person or even one family, and in some instances a whole community, can relocate for their benefit. And that's a fundamental right. As human beings, we have a fundamental right to continue to exist. We have a fundamental right to have access to the bounty that the government didn't put there. Something else put it there in place, whether you're a believer in creation or whether you're a believer in the intelligence of the environment recreating itself, it's all the same thing. The government didn't put it there. It was that mysterious force that allowed that bounty to be there, and it's there for every living thing. and every human being has the right to that. So that's implied in that one word. And in that way, it might be related that their reasoning for moving has something to do with maybe economic hardship, economics being sustenance and survival. I think that's going to work better. So this means that the idea of immigration in Okanagan, in the Okanagan sense, presupposes three things. One, that there is a need for the person or the family or that community to move, and that's a fundamental presupposition in that. And number two, that it is a fundamental freedom to relocate because we're human and because we are given the commandment to survive, and we must survive however we can. And number three, that selective exclusion measures do not exist in that word or in that idea. So from the Seal point of view, if someone decides to move to the Okanagan, to my community, the criteria of the receiving community is what comes into play. And I think that's what policy is, that Canadian policy is a criteria of the receiving community, right, in terms of people relocating. For the Okanagan, the Seal, historically, from what I've read, that makes very clear to me that any person that joins a community, and believe me, our people were immigrating from one community to another a lot, and from one Salish neighboring community, as well as non-Salish neighboring communities. If you check out and look at Anastasiou's research in the 1960s, for instance, his PhD was on looking at the plateau peoples and the idea of not only of resource use, but also the idea of intermarriage connections. And it was even shocking to me how wide those were, right? And how wide the immigration movement was. It wasn't just based on marriage, but people relocating to various areas. The first main requirement is that each place requires of its human occupants certain ways of being, specific ways of being that the people that have been there a long time have learned about and have been following. So you could say that the Seal laws are based on the Tamih that surround us and the way that they've informed us that we have to be in order to allow ourselves to be here. So that the non-interference policy is a really important one, that when you move to someone else's band, if I move to Vernon, then I have to conform to what that land requires of me. So what that means then is that the people who live in that community have a responsibility. Because when I move there, I don't know anything about how they do things or how I'm expected to be or anything like that. And I think that's similar to any new person coming onto any new area. And so the responsibility of the community is to inform me and is to embrace the fact that I am clueless and to have the compassion and the understanding that requires. And so one of the things that I know is that a person coming into the receiving community from the Seal view must conform to what the place requires first of all. So they can't step out of line. And this I'm talking about traditionally. I'm not talking about now because there's a lot of stepping out of line in terms of what the place requires. But all of that, the first main directive is to become part of the human community that's there in terms of their livelihood practices and the knowledge systems that they've acquired in terms of why these customs, why those rules, why those laws, and all of those kinds of things that guide people to live in harmony and balance, not only with each other, but with the other relatives out on the land. So they must follow the laws. They must follow the protocols that are required by custom of that place at all times. So that's fundamental. But one of the things that is aside from all the other regular common good, and that's speaking about the common good in terms of the laws and the protocols and the common good of all other living things on the land, is their own common good as well. So where religious practice is concerned, all, even Syilx people, every individual, Pauline, myself, all have different families. We all come from different communities. Pauline comes from the Lower Snoqualmie Band, he comes from the West Bank First Nation, and I'm from Penticton. And we know that every extended family has a different set of religious rituals, ceremonies, and every community has a different set of religious rituals, yet we're all Syilx, we're all Okanagan. And I would never think if I moved to West Bank First Nation to start telling them, no, that don't work for me. And they would never think if I moved there to start telling me, I don't like your religious practice, you do that or you don't do that. What's understood very clearly by the Syilx people is that every individual, every family, and every community has the absolute and fundamental right to have that connection with the Creator in their own way, as long as it's founded on the common good of the community. So that's really where that looks at. If it's not interfering with the common good of the community, then whose problem is it, right? Whose problem is it? So that's a real serious question when it comes to some of the debates that you're hearing in this election thing that's going on. And I think it's really an important point. It's really an important issue, because religious freedom is a fundamental right. It is a fundamental right. But as I said, there's that balance between what is social justice and the common good. And so from our point of view, that common good is equal with the social justice that's required to practice your connection in any way that you need to practice to fulfill that part of your life spiritually. So in the Okanagan, there's no problem with that. If I decide, and I'm in the West Bank community, that I need to do this, I would speak to whoever the spiritual leader, elder, chief, or whoever my relatives were and say, this is what I need to do, and this is why I need to do it, and I need you to understand that. And we would enter into a dialogue. And then the elder would say, okay, so in this circumstance, it's this way, and in that circumstance, it's that way. And we'd come to an agreement, but I would be the person that would be looked after in that sense. They would find every way to try to accommodate what I need to fulfill myself spiritually, what I need if I require that. In a sense, the Okanagan people believe that it is a life and death situation where religion and spirituality is concerned, that people must, in the very last instance, have the right to be able to enter into that other realm in the way that they determine. And so all accommodations would be made as much as possible without fear mongering and so on going on. It would be with understanding, with collaborative thought and transparency in the community. So that, I think, idea is one of the principles, I think, that is really an important one for the Syilx people. The other part of it is in terms of customs and practice. When a person comes into a receiving community, the responsibility isn't theirs to become part of the community. The responsibility of the community is to learn about them and to educate them, to inform them, but most of all to embrace them, to include them as part of their community, and to show compassion as to how to be part of the community by including them, by making sure you stand them up and you acknowledge them, by making sure that their needs are met fully in the same way everyone else's are met. And that's really an important philosophical principle of our society, that we think of people as not from somewhere else, not the other, or not belonging, that we think of people as, you're here, you belong, but there's certain things you need to learn, and we're here to help you do that. And while we're helping you do that, that you have a responsibility to be receptive to that. So one of the things that happens, for instance, we Okanagans say, we never marry out, we marry in. Meaning that whoever marries into our families, they become part of who we are. They become part of our family. They become part of us, and they're not seen in a different way. There are many women here that are married in from the Métis community. Many of our chiefs have had wives from the Métis community. Many of our, and this is why we have names like McLean, McDougall. We have names like Bono and Marchand and Pierre and Pion, and I could go on. And why we have a name like Armstrong, right? My great-grandfather was married into, one of my great-grandmother was married into an Irish family. And I never knew that. There's a family in which there are black ancestors. I never knew that one of my dad's uncles was black. I grew up all my life hearing about him, but I wondered why my dad knew how to pick guitar and sing spiritual that I didn't recognize, right, on the guitar. And then later on I asked him, well, who was John Norwood? He said, oh, he was your auntie's, his auntie's husband, and he was black. And I said, really? That's how come you know how to sing those kinds of songs? And he said, yeah. So, all my life I never knew that, because there's a very visible blindness by cultural standards of the Okanagan people to see color and race and make difference in that way. And so that's one of the things that, in terms of the responsibility of the community, of the whole community, to make welcome. And we're very, very, very strict about that. When this university, UBC, this institution moved here, we know what this institution means. We know and understand its importance, right, in terms of how the people who are relatives use it, that the significance of that required a formal welcoming by the Okanagan Nation, a formal gesture of gift giving and mutual respect and mutual responsibility. I think that signing, the 10-year signing of UBC is going to take place on Monday at 3 o'clock, so some of you might want to be there to witness that. But that kind of idea, I think, is really important. There was also two relative ideas that relate to refugees that I wanted to touch briefly on. The idea of refugees, I've done some research on that in the Okanagan, is really remarkable. I'll give you 3 examples of that idea of pre-contact. There was a group of people that Pauline is by bloodline related to, that came into the Okanagan from the Athapascan people, and the Ashinola area of the Smokemean and some parts of the Nicola Valley was occupied by those people. those people had their own defined land areas, and then when the smallpox came, it wiped out a lot of them because their DNA wasn't as strong as the Okinawans in this area. And so at Hula, their chief had moved from the Methow part of the Okanagan Valley over the mountains and found a small group of them left in the St. Mead. And the idea of that group living in isolate, surrounded by Okinawans, in my mind is not something that's remarkable, but I guess in other contexts it might be remarkable in that they had a total different language, total different customs. We can't even say some of their words that remain in the language of the Okanagan. So that's one instance pre-contact in which we know that there was a whole group that immigrated here from the south. And we also know that sometime just before contact, that a group of Shoshone people who were facing hostilities by the Blackfeet and other Plains tribes, Buffalo people, that they were being harassed continuously in the northern parts of the state of Idaho and Montana on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and that they were continuously moved north until they were a very small group that eventually is now in the area of British Columbia called the Kootenays. Those are the Kootenay people. And we know that the name we have for them is Tealt, right? Our Okanagan name for them is Tealt. What does that mean? Well, the last part of the word Ilt means child of, children of. The first part means torn away. So it's a recognition that they're children of those people who were torn away from their lands and were chased over the Rocky Mountains. And it's also an understanding, too, that the Kootenai have their own designated area and that we are separate from them and we intermarried with them, but that they were children in our territory. And so there's something to that idea. Another more recent one is in the policy of the Americans. American policy for colonizing and taking over land was much more violent than it is in Canada. And some of you may know the story of Chief Joseph and his band of Nez people who were chased out of the Walla Walla Valley and came north, tried to cross the border into Alberta to seek refuge there, and didn't make it. And then he was eventually, imprisoned for the resistance. But before he was imprisoned, one of the chiefs, his name was Half Sons, my husband's great grandfather, he was Moses Columbia chief. His name was Sukdum. And so he's kind of you'll read about him if you look it up. Well, he was one of the chiefs that sat down and was friends with the Nez Perce chiefs and relatives of the Nez Perce chiefs, blood relatives in some cases of the Nez Perce chiefs, gave refuge to the Nez Perce band of Chief Joseph on our southern Okanagan reservation in Nispelem. And they have remained there ever since. And in that context, the whole community can remain intact in terms of the rights that they have to their language, their cultural identity, and their customs. Everyone in the Okanagan can go to Nispelem and witness the 7 drums rituals that they have. And no one in the Okanagan would ever say to them, that's not right, you're in Okanagan territory, because they are refugees in our territory. We defended their right to be there, and we still defend their right to be there. And so, as a group, as a whole group, they have land base over in the Kootenays. As a group, there is integrated land base in our Okanagan Nation reservations. And so that idea, I think that idea is, in my mind, a real different way to situate what could be done, what might be thought about, and what our responsibilities might be as Canadians, because the history of Canadian policy, and I don't know, like I said, I'm not a researcher in that area, but I know there are some things about it that stand out, that we all know that the specific measures that historically, was the immigration policy to reject or exclude people was specifically based on racial origins. We know that. It's a terrible part of our history here in Canada, and that's well known. And that has changed, and even though Canada can no longer discriminate based on the color of an applicant's skin or their religion, there's other criteria that amounts to the same thing. And I think that's something that people don't understand, that very clearly that idea to reject certain occupations or to demand certain language skills or in a number of different ways create criteria which profiles targeted groups and excludes targeted groups from entering, I think is no different than racial discrimination. And if you look through that lens, you can see it. And so, but it seems that the selfish ways in which exclusionary policies are made are not about those people whose humanitarian needs are paramount. That idea that the SEAL have is about the need, regardless of how difficult it was to get along, and still is to get along with the state, with the Kootenays. And we've had our skirmishes with them. We've had our wars with them after their movement into our territory. And we've had our defenses of them as well. And so, by the same token, it hasn't been that easy in the Colville Confederated Reservation with regard to the Nez Perce, right? In terms of how they might reorganize how they make decisions and things. One of the works around factionalism on the Colville Reservation was a real interesting read to me in terms of how factionalized some things can be, but they work it out. They live together because humans have a right to do that. Anyway, as Troper, who's an immigration historian, has mentioned, almost every nation's immigration policy is written through an economic prism. And Canada's, there's no doubt about it, that it's written through an economic prism. It's not about human need and humanitarian needs and social justice. In the Federal Skilled Worker Program, or under the Provincial Nominee Program for immigrants, only 9% are for humanitarian reasons from the statistics that I've read in general related to immigration. I've read that over 70% of immigrants to Canada are economic immigrants. They're brought here for economic purposes and criteria through for those purposes. That's astounding. And that only 18% of those people come through through family reunification. So that's a very, very small percentage in terms of what that policy is directed toward and what it's targeting. So in particular, the newest changes in the last few years, since 2014, which mean fewer permanent residents and more temporary foreign workers in relation to those percentages, is not only alarming but very clearly situated to benefit business. And it's not about humanitarian purposes or reasons or profitability. And I think that's really shameful on our part. I have to stand as a SEAL person and say, that's not something that my people would stand for. And if you think about The changes which mean fewer permanent residents and more temporary foreign workers, that's clearly situated to benefit business in terms of the kinds of categories that people are allowed in as well. There's something really alarming about that in terms of skilled work preferences. There's actual categories of preferences, and if you meet those preferences, you might be allowed in, like management, professional occupations, skills requiring 2 years of university and apprenticeships. And then below that, the low-skilled temporary workers and the narrow window of programs and the times that they can become and that they can be exploited and sent back is repugnant, to say the least, from the SEAL perspective. And I see how they're treated by people in the communities. And I feel for them. And I look at them and I think, what is happening in this world is our doing in these countries. And when we think about the refugee problems, that whole idea of the economic prism and the protectionism, I think is really an important one to think about in relation to immigration policy and how we might need to rethink it or it will be cast upon us. So one of the things that I want to leave you with is that these comments, if they're disturbing, that we've made, are made from the perspective of a SEAL person. And the work that I do as a researcher is to try to open up alternative thoughts in relation to us as human beings in terms of the philosophical values that we might need to shift. We as human beings have shifted our values continuously. We're not stuck in some window, in the 16th century or the 17th or the 18th or the 19th or the 20th century. We're always shifting for humanitarian reasons because we have reason. And we're tying that reason to our heart. We're tying that reason to what we as human beings can be in our most beautiful sense. The diversity of our cultures, the diversity of human beings on this planet is the beauty of this world, is the beauty of this planet. And we can never forget that in the policies that are made. So I really urge you to think about ways in which we can move all together forward in a good way. And that idea of love, that idea of compassion, always be the reason that we move things forward. Okay, what?